Hello, everyone. I'm Michael. Thank you so much for coming to my talk this afternoon. I gave an early morning talk at MIT this morning and was informed that it was rude to get the grad students and the postdocs out of bed that early. And now we're approaching that slumber part of the afternoon. So I hope I can keep you awake. And thank you so much to Roberto and John and Mike and everyone and Yanis and everyone else for hosting me here at short notice. It's a bit of a whirlwind visit, so I'm very grateful for the logistics of organizing this. So it is so incredibly great to be back in the US, not just the US, but Boston in particular. I did my first ever sabbatical overseas in Boston, almost exactly 10 years to the day, which David at Harvard said makes us feel old. But it was a wondrous 6 months. We had a new 6-month-old. It was our first stint living overseas, and it was just a really defining moment. So I've always regarded Boston as a second home away from home, and it's just so fantastic to be back here. So for today's talk, to, I guess, contextualize what I'll cover in the brief time I have with you, I have a few different hats that I'm wearing when I'm talking with you. So I'm fortunate to co-lead a robotics research center with sort of around 100 people in it back in Australia. And we're a typical sort of large robotics research center that does a lot of different stuff. And I'll show you a little bit about what we do. Like every prof, I have my own research group, and I'm very passionate about policy advice, science, and outreach around topics of AI, robotics, AI being particular topical everywhere. Who here has tried ChatGPT for some aspect of what they do? Fantastic. The title slide was generated using Midjourney version 5. And so I brought a couple of books from my startup company that does outreach around these topics for kids and older kids, so grab one afterwards. In my group, we are primarily roboticists, so we primarily publish in the robotics space, but we also dabble quite a bit in computer vision, and when we have enough emotional reserves, we also try and publish in machine learning or biological venues, but robotics is our core area of work. So today's talk is really in 2 parts. The first part, what I'll do is I'll give you a bit of a taster of a very small percentage of the work that we do. Well, I'll introduce our center and my research group, and then I'll give you a bit of a taster for 4 core areas of work that we've worked on, broadly in the area of biologically or neural inspired, perception and mapping for robots and autonomous vehicles. I'll then, in part 2, go on to a little bit of a rant, hopefully an informed rant. So basically, I've spent 20 years with my group and my collaborators going from fundamental theory from neuroscience and from robotics and from machine learning, all the way to trying to make these systems work on embodied, intelligent, autonomous platforms like robots. And in the course of doing that and a lot of painful experiences, we've learned a lot about what we think are some of the things that are necessary for the research to be really informative for end-use applications. And I want to talk about 3 particular issues. And I believe that these issues apply equally well across how we do robotics and computer science research, but also how we think about how we assess and analyze the animal or insect systems that many of us study in our labs. And I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts on what I have to say. And I'll wrap it up. So this is our QUT Center for Robotics. This is some of us at our annual retreat, large research center filled with anyone from undergrad research assistants all the way up to distinguished professors, including my co-director, Peter Cork. We work in a wide range of domains. So we work at fundamental blue sky research all the way to quite applied research with a large range of industry and commercial partners, government partners, and startup partners all around the world. We have a bunch of funding and collaborations with US organizations. I currently collaborate with Ford, Amazon, Intel, and NVIDIA in the US, but also a lot of Australian companies. We work in the land, air, and sea domain, and also the undersea and underland domain. So in the air, we work on autonomous aerial platforms all the way up to reasonable size fixed-wing aircraft. In a range of civilian applications. This could be drones counting cute koalas, counting marine animals, drones detecting invasive species. We are flying drones in Antarctica at the moment and learning the challenges of getting drones and robot technology to actually work in an extreme environment like Antarctica. And we don't just create the core technology, we create the enabling technology. So with drones proliferating, air traffic control is an unscalable problem. And so one of our researchers or academics is developing and trialing semi-automated air traffic approval systems for drones. And these systems are in active trials at 3 airports in Australia and also overseas. So not just the core technology, but what makes the technology capable of being deployed. Lots of autonomous vehicles work in mining, agriculture, on-road and off-road, medical robotics, and also a lot of work in environment. So Australia is relatively renowned for its great outdoors and the environment, especially its marine environment. And so we have a large program of marine robotics, both surface-based robotics and underwater robotics, helping preserve and protect some of our great natural assets. I'll show you one example. This is QUT, which is probably the most famous robot that our centre has worked on. QUT is an acronym that stands for crown of thorns starfish. It's an invasive species on the Great Barrier Reef, one of our massive coral reefs. And this robot's job is to run around the reef using what was relatively early stage deep learning computer vision pipelines, automatically detect this crown of thorns starfish and stab it to death with a large syringe filled with, I think, a vinegar-like solution. Divers previously did this. Divers do not scale very well. Divers are, no insult to humans, are relatively slow. They need to come up and replenish their air tanks, etc. The appeal of robots is theoretically you can scale them up to cover a very large area and operate them 24/7. Google then gave us some funding to develop a subsequent fleet of these, and there's a whole range of marine platforms that we have deployed in our group. And this has been led by one of my colleagues, Professor Matthew Dunbar. The key thing that we do is we still work at the cutting edge in terms of blue sky research. So we're still publishing extensively at the top machine learning, computer vision, robotics, and control conferences and venues. It's getting increasingly difficult as a university to stay competitive in that area, but we are trying. But then we learn a lot from taking it all the way from these research fields, these abstract research theories and models, to systems that have to survive the rigors of real world deployments. This is my research group at a recent lab dinner, or some of my research group, a great bunch of people. And I guess the research philosophy, which some of you have seen me talk about many times, we're at universities still, so we're driven by scientific curiosity. We like to investigate interesting problems, which is a wonderful perk of our job. But we're also driven by motivation from our industry partners. So government, industry come to us with problems and we try and solve them. We do draw a lot on biological and behavioural inspiration. We draw a lot on neural inspiration. I'll show you a couple of examples of that. We use every neural network architecture under the sun, and then some classical neural network architectures from 20 or 30 years ago, as well as the most recent architectures that came out in the last few months and everything in between. We put these on all sorts of embodied systems in the real world. They never work the first time, the second time, or the 20th time, but it's through that iterative process of understanding what's going wrong and either getting more insights from our interdisciplinary colleagues or just engineering our solutions. We learn a lot about the nature of the problems in, for example, navigation that we are trying to solve. So I'll very briefly cover some of the historical systems that we've done. It'll only take a couple of minutes, and then talk about some of the recent work we're doing in this field. So I was one of the key developers of a system called RAT-SLAM in robotics. SLAM is an acronym for simultaneous localization and mapping. It's the core problem of if you have a robot or an animal in a new environment, how does it build or construct a map of that environment while simultaneously keeping track of where it is positioned or located within that map? It's a classical problem in robotics. It's usually within the top 4 or 5 research keywords in robotics. People have been joking that it's been solved for at least 10 or 20 years, and yet it's still one of the dominant research fields. And it has not been solved to the full extent, I would argue. Roboticists love spatial neuroscience in particular. Part of my sabbatical was in Mike's lab, which was amazing. And we love spatial neuroscience because for us grounded roboticists, it gives us very concrete, tangible correlates of processes like spatial navigation. So there are many, many types of navigational cells in the brain, and you've probably heard Mike and others talk about these. This is an example of a place cell. Everywhere that there's a bit of yellow shading is where one particular cell has fired, so it's responsive to a place, hence called a place cell. And we have head direction cells that respond to the direction of the head, not the animal, the head. We have grid cells that respond over a tessellating triangular grid of locations. We have cells that respond to barriers at a distance as well. And for roboticists, this is a dream because we have things we can fairly concretely model and turn into a high-performance robot system. So we've done many, many years of iteration of these systems. This is the system called RATSLAM, which is still in use today. This is a sort of a schematic. At the left, we have the core neural network that drives the system. This is a spatial neural network that encodes very roughly the robot's internal representation of space in the world. And the type of network is not a modern deep network. It's called a continuous attractor neural network. It has excitatory and inhibitory connections. And in essence, the dynamics of this network are like a sort of poor person's Kalman filter or particle filter. So it emulates some of the probabilistic nature of conventional robot mapping navigation systems. The representation of space that this system learns becomes very discontinuous and very hard to interpret, which means it's very hard for a robot to navigate using it. So in the middle, we have a graphical map, which is like an interpretation of the representation of space in this network. We call it an experience map, but basically it's a graphical map that represents the topology of the environment. Since we started this work, there's been lots of other animal systems that have been modeled to varying degrees. Bat slam, dolphin slam, pigeon slam, hamster slam, ant slam, fish bladder slam, whisker slam, and a few others. If you do I always make this joke, but if you do a paper that has an animal name in it and the word slam in it, it will almost certainly get sent to me to repeat. So what could we do with this system? There were two pivotal experiments. At the time, who here is a grad student? All right. So at the time, it was pretty brutal because we were getting rejected from papers because they basically said you weren't doing anything significant in neuroscience and you weren't doing anything significant in robotics, so you should just go away. And so we took it upon us to show that these systems were performant or very capable in robotics. This was a 2-week continuous mapping and navigation SLAM experiment. We ran over 2 floors of 2 different buildings. Essentially, it was a stress test. So the robot was continually navigating and mapping these 2 building floors, and it was choosing random locations to navigate to. If it made it to the location it had chosen to navigate to, that was a navigation success. If it didn't, it was a failure. So over the 2 weeks, at all times of day and night, it did 1,177 successful navigation trials out of 1,178. And by the end of the experiment, because I was watching it, I was a stressed out, I think, postdoc at the time, I was confident enough to basically leave it alone because it was an entirely autonomous system and disappear for a few hours, which was a nice thing to be able to do in retrospect. The other thing we're able to demonstrate, and we've done a lot of work since then in this, is that these systems have great potential for scalability in time and space. So on the right, you can see a video of the final output of this system using just the visual input from a low-quality webcam on a laptop strapped to the roof of my car, which did a 40-mile, drove a 40-mile journey around the very convoluted road network. You can see in the top right red trajectory, and you can see the topological map being created by the system, which was not metrically precise. It wasn't accurate to the nearest inch or centimeter, but it was topologically correct. Everything was connected appropriately. At the time, this was the largest environment anyone had mapped with a visual SLAM system in robotics, and this was superseded by Oxford a couple of years later. So that's this historical work. I want to talk about a little bit about some work we've been doing in the last few years. And there's a bit of a mea culpa here. So a few years ago, I realized that I was only doing research in my group that was research where I could clearly see a path to something that would definitively work, which is good career-wise, but not really good for scientific exploration. And for years, I've been very skeptical and critical of neuromorphic approaches. So these are like spiking neural networks and neuromorphic cameras, which I'll explain in a second. But a bunch of people who I've been working with or interacting with eventually convinced us to really dive into this work much more deeply. So I'll talk about 2 particular pieces of work. One on spiking neural networks, and Samaya and Toby have been leading this work. If you haven't heard about neuromorphic hardware, it's basically compute hardware that doesn't work like a standard computer. It more closely, although not identically, mimics the spiking neural networks that underpin a lot of computation in the brain. The appeal, or the theoretical appeal of this stuff, and Intel's doing it, but a number of other companies are doing it, and John and I were just talking about this before, is that this hardware is extremely power efficient. It has high parallelizability. and also low latency potential. So theoretically, it's very good for things like low power, edge-based robots or edge-based computing, and a number of other areas. Doesn't stack up so well for autonomous vehicles because power isn't such a big issue. There are certain domains where it makes sense. So we started, it's a very challenging field to work in. A lot of the initial work consisted of taking conventional neural network architectures, training those, and then basically copying the weights over into a spiking neural network. We also took sort of the sensible, easy path in. So we adapted some of the early models, which did digit recognition, so recognizing characters, which is where most computer vision research starts. And we adapted the digit recognition task to the task of visual place recognition, which is the core theme of much of our research. And visual place recognition is just if your robot sees a picture of an image of a place, and it has a map or database of places that it's learned before, can it compare that current image to all those images in its database and work out whether it's sufficiently similar to somewhere it's been before, and then say, well, that's probably the location I'm at. It's a very simple, yep.
So can you, in principle, simulate, suppose you develop a neural network model, traditional deep learning model, could you simulate it with an architecture of this type?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of papers that just effectively train it with the conventional network and then just port the weights over to a spiking neural network architecture, and that seems to work reasonably well.
And that would also include transformer layers?
I don't know if they've done that. And copying them over isn't particularly scientifically satisfying. It was a step that had to be made. I don't know what the most recent work is.
Okay. So
we adapted the digit recognition task. I'll run you through the briefs of the network. This is a symbolized version of the top six pixel image of what a robot camera might see. We convert the intensities of pixels from the camera into spike trains, Poisson distribution spiking trains that have an average frequency proportional to the intensity of the pixel. That is a relatively arbitrary transformation. We needed some way of converting imagery into spike trains, and that's the one we chose, but there's lots of other ways you can do it. Each of these pixels maps one-to-one onto what we call these input neurons. These input neurons are fully interconnected to that middle green layer, and those connections are dynamic. That middle green layer is an excitatory layer. It projects to an inhibitory layer, which then back projects inhibition into that excitatory layer. And the excitatory layer is what you interpret, I won't go into the details of that, in order to get your place recognition matches, which basically tell you where you think you are. Yes?
Do you have any systems where you have pre-processing done on that? Because in the retina, right, you have your retinal ganglion cells, and they do a little bit of pre-processing before it actually hits the rostral cone.
Yeah.
So that pre-processing, is that like included inside like kernels and stuff?
So it's literally a simple equation that converts a pixel intensity into a spike.
Gotcha.
It's like the minimum viable product, which could then have all of these things added to it.
Sure.
There's a lot of other stuff that you need to do to get these networks to actually behave in a performant manner. You have very uneven allocation of neurons to all the places you want to learn in the world. So there's some normalization you can do around that. You also get hyperactive neurons. So these are neurons that are very excited about every place in the world. And so you need measures to deal with that hyperactivity. And at the bottom of the slides throughout this whole presentation, you'll see a bunch of references. A lot of this is actually work that's coming out in the robotics conference next month. But once you implement all those practices, you can actually get system performance that is at least in the ballpark of conventional computer vision approaches. And we're happy with being in the ballpark at the moment, but we're working towards being able to beat the conventional approaches. One of the really exciting things about these spiking neural networks is they suit modular approaches very well. So ideally, a lot of our group's work is working towards mapping the entire world, essentially, and you need scalability of your system to do that. One of the things you can do is you can deploy thousands or millions, or really there's no limit, depending on your hardware, of tiny individual spiking neural networks. So the largest layer might have 400 neurons in it. And that individual neuron, that individual small network is responsible for learning, for example, just 25 places in the world. So one network module might just be responsible for learning 25 locations in this room. And then you can parallelize a lot of these networks together, as many as you want, depending on the size of the environment. And this is highly performant. It's very parallelizable, so it should suit the hardware very well. And so on a sort of a couple of watts device or whatever it is, you might be able to do very capable, very large scale mapping and navigation systems for robots. And so this is work that will appear next month at ICRA. The other area of neuromorphic area that we're working in, this is Toby led, is dynamic vision sensors or event cameras. These have been around for a while. There's been niche groups working on these, or not niche groups, some of the leading groups in the world working on these for many years, but it's still a niche field, I think would be fair to say, although it's started to appear in the top computer vision conferences. So event cameras detect changes in pixel intensity and the polarity of that change. So you can see an aggregation of events from an event camera in the column on the right, and the blue and the red indicate the polarity. So is it getting brighter or is it getting darker? Now, this video on the right, each frame of that video has been created by aggregating events over a certain time scale. And that time scale you aggregate events over or interpret events over is completely arbitrary. You can make it anything you want. So one of the really nice aspects of this, which is distinct to event cameras, is it makes them very suitable for ensemble-based approaches. So the basic idea of this is you can reconstruct or interpret images from these event cameras, but you can do it at any time scale. You could do it over a 1 microsecond window, over a 1 second window, over a 10-second window, whatever you want. And so what we do in this ensemble approach, and the references are at the bottom, is we run a bunch of different image reconstruction pipelines that reconstruct these images at a systematic range of different timescales. I can't remember the exact range, but it's like from very small microseconds up to 150 milliseconds.
So does anybody use these to watch plants grow?
Too slow. People use them for like very high speed stuff. People have used them for, I think, monitoring, and I think MIT's done some of this as well, monitoring blood. I think they've used them for blood monitoring from cameras, I think, to complement normal cameras. It's sort of a theoretically great technology that is still in search of a killer application, smartphones being the closest they've come to it. So what we do is we create reconstructions of imagery from a lot of different timescale durations. We run a place recognition or localization pipeline on each of these different pipelines completely in parallel. And then we fuse the results of all those different systems together. And the result is you get really amazing performance. So this is a performance graph. All you need to know is that vertical higher up is better. And along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you have the time scale over which these images are being, or time duration over which they're being reconstructed. Our system, which is an ensemble approach, is the dashed dotted line at the top, and all the other results have been normalized against that. And we have two baseline systems that pick an arbitrary single time duration to reconstruct these images from. And you can see the ensemble approach is far superior. The ensemble approach is also a lot more data set agnostic because you don't have to know anything about the characteristics of the data set, the platform, or the speed of the platform through it. A lot of the conventional concepts from computer vision or visual research in humans and animals are interesting to explore in the event camera space. This is a paper that Toby did on salience. So we came up with one of the simplest possible measures of salience, which was we deemed pixels that vary a lot in their event count or their event trigger over the course of a data set to be salient. So variance as a proxy for salience. And that's what those blue dots are in this image on the bottom right. We have some local region suppression, so you don't get all the blue dots in just one region of the image. And use these as a way to predict which pixels are most useful for the task of localization or visual place recognition. Event cameras also have other useful properties. They are somewhat velocity invariant. So if you run a vehicle or a drone or a platform along a route, and the first time you travel the route, you do it fast. The second time you do it slow and then fast and then slow and then fast. You get a lot of, the events are somewhat invariant to that. So you get a lot of natural invariance to velocity, which would break a simplified conventional system. So these have really interesting properties. So this is another results graph, which is probably the one we're most excited about, or I'm most excited about. This is a performance graph again. The vertical axis is recall at 99% precision. Once again, being higher up on this graph is better. The x-axis is the number of pixels we're considering, starting from 1 all the way to 250. So there are two key takeaways from this image. The first is that when you use this measure of salience that we propose, which is not very sophisticated, but potentially biologically implementable, the blue bars are the salience-based system and the orange bars are the pick a random pixel solution. So the salience-based solution is always substantially better than the random pixel solution. But what's much more exciting about this is the number of pixels you need. So these images have hundreds of thousands or millions of pixels in them, and you can get very high performance localization using 5 or 10 select pixels, which is really exciting because it's more like pointing a laser beam into the environment at a few locations than an entire image array, which is very potentially interesting for all sorts of practical, commercially relevant applications.
So these pixels are all the same resolution, and it's just how many you're sampling out of the image.
Yeah, they're all uniform pixels. Yeah.
And are they a rectangular array or a linear array?
It's a rectangular. It's a normal. It's a rectangular array, and we're so
it's 10 by 25.
No, the whole image is, I can't remember what the Davis resolution is. It might be 640 by 480. So there's 250,000 pixels, and we're sampling from 5 or 10 and getting good performance, even with the randomly selected pixels, which is really crazy. I guess we're still optimistic but skeptical. So the key questions are really, what substantive benefits do neuromorphic approaches actually provide? We're still sort of open and agnostic on this. One of the really interesting things we've discovered, and we've continued to do this, is we're discovering all sorts of potential benefits of these spiking neural networks and event cameras. But the question you've always got to ask is, are those benefits actually unique to these technologies, or can you take the concepts and then apply them to conventional compute and conventional cameras and still get the same performance advantages? And that's something we're continually testing. It looks like in some cases the benefits aren't unique, and in some cases there genuinely do seem to be distinct benefits to these systems. However, we don't understand what they are quite yet. And so that's where the third question comes in. Where those systems seem to be genuinely different, how can you mechanistically explain why they are better? One theory that we're working on, especially for the ensembling approaches, is that the statistical distribution of performance of the localization pipelines based on lots of different implementations of these systems are in some way more suitable for ensemble or fusion-based approaches than ensembling a bunch of conventional computer vision pipelines. All right, and just to give myself a chance to get a drink, for my final project coverage, I will play a 1-minute video that gives you a bit of an overview for it. So this is, we have a lot of projects in my group and in our center, but this is the flagship project that I'm particularly involved with leading for the next 4 or so years. What we're trying to do in essence is use all of the stuff that you've seen in this talk, plus a lot of other stuff and a lot of hard learnings from the last 20 or so years of research to create a universal ubiquitous alternative to GPS. The primary motivation behind that is there are all sorts of scenarios where GPS could go down temporarily or even permanently, and modern society is critically reliant on GPS in many ways that we don't really appreciate on a day-to-day basis. And so this is a sort of flagship project that we're leading, and it has aspects of bio-inspiration, but more importantly, it's not just about the tech. So this project is driven just as much by privacy concerns, data security concerns, and societal acceptance concerns. So the whole thing is engineered to basically be making technology that is embraced by society and that would serve as a viable alternative, like a ubiquitous positioning service you could think of, just like we use GPS. And so we're very excited about this project. It's in its early stages, but you can imagine sort of some of the elements of what you've seen during this talk going into it. And we're also working on lots of other stuff. So lots of other bio-inspired stuff, lots of what we call semantic understanding and semantic mapping. So giving robots an actual meaningful understanding of the world in which they move around, and just about everything in between. It's always a challenge to work out what to cover in a short talk. And lots of application areas. So a lot of the insights you're going to hear about in the last part of my talk are really driven by all of these areas we work in autonomous vehicles, surgical robotics, off-road autonomous vehicles, and so forth. All right. So the second part of the talk, I really want to talk about three key insights. I'm going to motivate these insights in the context of, I guess, enduring autonomy. Enduring autonomy is something we would like our robots to be able to have, so they work and work for a long period of time. Enduring autonomy is something that the natural kingdom already solves seemingly effortlessly across such an incredibly diverse range of organisms. Our group has really been focusing all of its efforts on spanning the entire spatial range and temporal range of enduring autonomy. So some of these projects you've already seen, working on localization or positioning systems that work at sort of the millimeter level in surgical robotics, all the way up to the global level in terms of the mapping system I just showed you in the video, and systems that are extremely responsive at low latencies, like these neuromorphic systems, all the way to deployed autonomous positioning systems that are intended to last for many years. So you've got the whole, I guess, spectrum of spatial and temporal scales across our projects. We're not blindly faithful to any particular approach. We will throw any approach at these problems that yields advances. You've seen many of these. The other one I'd mention is simulation. We use a lot of, and even physics. Why learn everything from scratch when you can benefit from what the physics community has learned over many hundreds of years? In terms of enduring autonomy, we've done a lot of work in this space. We've done work in algorithmic approaches. This was back 10 years ago at ICRA with one of its vision paper. We've done bio-inspired approaches to enduring positioning autonomy. And in the computer vision community, we've published classical, well, not classical, modern learning-based approaches to this problem in conferences like CVPR. So we really are trying to attack this from all the different directions. So what we've learned from doing this and trying to get these systems to actually work on deployment is a number of things, but I want to talk briefly about three key things. All areas are not equal. The limitations of the current metrics that drive the research field, and the most important one, the importance of introspection for autonomous systems. I'll illustrate these in a range of projects that we've worked on because they give very clear examples. This was a positioning project for autonomous underground mining vehicles that we worked on with Caterpillar and a bunch of other partners who are in the slide. Autonomous vehicles are so far a failed commercial concern, but one of the areas where they have been successfully deployed for a long time is in mining, especially in Australia. So they are actually a critical part of the commercial operations of many large mine sites in Australia and elsewhere. And the key component, and this is what a lot of modern society is built upon, is the minerals that these, or materials that these trucks help extract. And these are the sort of underground tunnel networks that these trucks operate in. So we were tasked with creating some better positioning systems for these vehicles. This is a sensor rig on a platform in the field. This rig is about this large. These vehicles can be 10, 20, 30 tons. And you can see that it's a very unforgiving environment. They get very dusty. Sometimes they break. It's a very tough environment for an autonomous system to work. This is one of the positioning systems we created. So what you're seeing is about a 5 or 6 mile journey deep underground into one of these underground mine sites. We tested this system extensively across 4 underground mine sites in Australia. And you can see a side map of the 600-yard descent into the mine site. It's partly censored, so you can't work out which mine site it is. And you can see part of the mapping system on the left. So this is the vehicle keeping track of where it is within a map of the environment that it's previously acquired. So one of the things we really learned from this work is that, and from other projects, is all errors are not created equal. So these simple schematics that you see, the blue line, the blue dots, this is an overhead view of the tunnel, the robot's moving down, or the vehicle's moving down. The blue dots are the walls of the tunnel as detected by like a laser sensor. And I'd want you to focus on the second and the third columns. So we're splitting the positional errors that a vehicle has into 2 components. The middle column is called down track error. So this is you're going down a tunnel, imagine between these tables. Down track error or longitudinal error is your error in how far down the tunnel you think you are. That error has hugely varying significance to the safe operation of that vehicle. When you're in the middle of the tunnel, you really don't care whether you're half a meter off or a meter off in that direction. When you need to make a critical turn out of that central tunnel, or there's a wall at the end of the tunnel that you're coming up to, you really do care if you're half a meter off. And so the significance of that error varies even within that tunnel, and it varies hugely. Cross-track error is the other type of error. So this is how much error there is in where the vehicle thinks it's located laterally or sideways as it's going down the tunnel. Cross-track error is understandably very important because you have a very expensive vehicle, it's moving at high speed, and if you're off by half a meter and that vehicle drives into an unforgiving rock wall, that is not a good day for anyone on the mine site. It can shut down operations, and on those big mine sites, if you shut down operations for a few hours, that can mean incredible amounts of money down the drain. The scale of these operations is just mind-boggling. So the point of this slide is really that not all errors have equal significance. Not all sensors have equal errors either. So the left column and the middle column show the distribution of positional estimates for a laser, which gives you the range to objects like the walls, and for a camera in the middle column. And you can see these have very different distributions. And although this is illustrated in a robotics context, I think all of this equally well applies to how we think about and assess animals. So the significance of how well an animal is localized really depends on what tasks it's performing, where in that task it is, and this can vary hugely. For any autonomous system, the significance of these areas varies hugely. And that's, I guess, the first key thing that we had learned, not just from this project, from a range of other projects. You really should evaluate how bad errors are contextually to really fairly assess them. The second project I'll illustrate in the context of an autonomous vehicles project we worked on, or are working on, with Ford Motor Corporation. I discovered much too late that by working with an automotive company, I'm now banned from actually getting into some of the autonomous vehicles because I can't sign the non-disclosure agreement because I'd be in violation of it. So no more autonomous vehicle rides for me in the Bay Area, which is very sad. So this is a typical table you'd see in a computer vision paper. Like this is from our CVPR paper in 2021. And so this is a localization paper. We're proposing a localization system, as are thousands of our colleagues. And the key thing is, how well does it perform? Now, the 2 key metrics are recall and tolerance achievement. So that's what's highlighted in the red box. So recall at 1, recall at 5, recall at 10. So based on the position estimates that your localization system you're proposing is throwing back at you, what percentage of those are correct? And the second one is what percentage of the position matches are within a certain metric and angular tolerance. And the tolerance varies, 0.25 meters, 2 degrees, all the way up to 5 meters and 10 degrees. These is the stock standard metrics upon which a significant chunk of these fields, robotics, computer vision, are based. One of the key problems with these metrics is that we don't think they tell the full story, or even half of the story, of how well a system can actually be used by an autonomous robot. So this is an example. I'm going to show you 2 animations. and I'll ask you to tell me which system do you think is better. The two scenarios I'm going to show you have identical performance metrics. The numbers are exactly the same, but you're going to tell me which one you think in practice is better or more safe. So blue means the vehicle is well localized, red means it doesn't know where it is. This is scenario one. I've played a couple of times. It's still the scenario one. And then I will show you a second scenario. Identical performance metrics based on the research fields and how they would report on these. Okay, this is scenario two. So there are multiple correct answers here in terms of why. Who has a theory on which of these scenarios is better, even though they have identical performance metrics?
Two.
Two? Why is two better?
It's blue during the crosswalks.
So it knows where it is at a contextually critical time. Any other reasons why two might be better?
Shorter duration.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Shorter duration. So one of the other things we should always consider is compensating mechanisms. So when you are lost temporarily, you can integrate motion information from other sensors on the car, as long as it's for a short period of time. And so two is substantially better in practical terms for at least two reasons, but the performance metrics that our whole field revolves around sees no difference between these scenarios. This is one of dozens of different examples where conventional performance metrics don't tell you the whole story. And this is really, the way we found this out was we were doing work across a range of projects. We were working on things that mattered to the end user, like worst case performance. You don't care about best case performance with an automated system. You care about when it's performing at its worst. You also care about coverage. So you'd like a system that has regular localization coverage, so it doesn't go for long periods of time without knowing where it is. So we developed all these, what we think were amazing contributions, massively improved worst case performance, massively improved localization coverage. And these changes were completely invisible to the performance metrics we would put in a paper to report on them. And until we did it, we didn't really realize how stark the difference was. And so that's really the point of this, that while we should keep those traditional performance metrics, and this would also apply, I think, for how we evaluate animals and insects and navigation in the natural kingdom, the context in which we evaluate these is critically important, I think. And the final one is introspection, which is really the most important one. And this is one we've pivoted a lot of our group to. So once again, I'm going to give you a choice. There's two localization systems to equip your robot, your drone with. System one knows where it is 99.9% of the time, but in that rare time that it's not working, it has no idea that it's not working. System two only works 99% of the time. You probably wouldn't get this accepted into a top computer science conference because it's not good enough. But of that remaining 1% of the time when it's non-functional, 99% of that time it's able to self-respect or introspect and report that it's not working properly. In any operationally critical deployment, in system one, you'll be acting unknowingly on incorrect information 0.1% of the time. Using system two, this drops to 0.01%. So system two is infinitely superior in any safety critical operation, despite having much worse flagship numbers. You'll hear about concepts like this around integrity, trust, guaranteed performance bounds in the robotics, the aerospace community, for example. And we've done some work on this. I'll show you one example in a second. Why is knowing when you don't know important? For a couple of reasons. One, you can stop. You can fail safe. You can go, I'm stopping, I don't know what I'm doing. If I keep acting, I might do something dangerous. The second thing is it facilitates human-robot collaboration. Increasingly, we're realizing that most autonomous systems will not be fully autonomous. They will have some level of human in the loop, some level of human collaboration and supervision. Introspection by both the human and the robot facilitates collaboration, and it facilitates handover in both directions, from human to robot, and especially from robot to human in an informed, safe manner. If you are a robot or an animal and you are able to introspect and realize that you suddenly don't understand the world anymore, and this is maybe relates to remapping in spatial neuroscience, you are able to trigger an update or an incremental update to your existing representations of how you think the world works. If your introspection processes are telling you you just absolutely don't know anything about the world, it could trigger a more drastic remapping. It could trigger some sort of relearning from scratch process, which is now possible in robotics. And so it's interesting to think about what these concepts are. I know there'd be analogs in spatial mapping, but also in other biological system processes. This is a surgical example. So we're trying to work on technology that will do one task in surgical robotics and one task very well. This is for shoulder joint replacement surgery, one of the fastest growing surgeries in the world. One of the critical parts of this operation is placing this guidance wire into the bone, because every part of the surgery from that point onwards relies on that guidance wire being placed appropriately. They attach the implants, and you need to get the guidance wire positioned precisely in terms of its angle and in terms of its position. So we're working on this technology to help the surgeons with this task. But just as importantly, we're working on introspection for the system so that when it doesn't know what it's doing, it is able to tell the surgeon, because the surgeon watching it will not necessarily be able to tell. So it's on the robot to call out for help. Another example, introspection examples abound. One of the things that we are learning, I guess, is animals learn throughout a substantial part of their lifetime. One of the challenges for AI systems and robotics is we think we probably need these systems to learn continually in any sophisticated application. If you just roll something out that has no learning capability, it's probably not going to do very well, except in very narrow, very niche, very constrained applications. Adding introspection, though, becomes incredibly difficult when online dynamic learning is added into the mix. So I think one of the grand challenges for the whole AI robotics community, and once again, maybe we can learn from biology, is how we can enable lifelong continuous dynamic learning for a system, whilst also having that system continuously able to introspect and to understand what it's doing and when it's struggling. This is one example in the localization domain that we're working on. It's basically a verification system for localization systems for autonomous vehicles, and there's a couple of papers on this. What we basically do is we train a system, and I won't go into much of the details, but we train a system to plop on top of any positioning or localization system and assess whether the estimates being put out by that system should be trusted or should not be trusted. So it's like a verification check for the underlying system. It's very simple. It's using support vector machines. It's not using any fancy modern machine learning machinery, but it's highly effective. So I'll show you what that means. Fast graph. This is a graph of localization performance. This is for an autonomous vehicle or a vehicle that has moved along a road, and there are 350 points along that road, at which point it's tried to work out where it is in the world. So you can see the graph, the x-axis has 350 points. On top of each of those points, there's a color-coded, marker-coded marker. So a green cross means the system correctly recognized where it was, and a red circle means the system made a stab or estimate of where it was in the environment and it got it wrong. We call that a false positive. Our method with the verification system thrown in is the leftmost graph, and then two baseline comparisons, which you put in for comparing apples to apples, are the two graphs on the right. So to illustrate explicitly, I'll add one more detail. There's a horizontal dashed line on all of these curves. This is the fussiness threshold of the underlying baseline system. So this is how fussy the system is about proposing a location estimate for where the vehicle is. If the line is very high on the graph, it's not very fussy at all. It's making lots and lots of estimates, many of which will be wrong. If the line is very, very low, it's very fussy. It's only making a small number of estimates. It's very reluctant to propose an estimate where it is. So with this verification system, what we can do is we can operate the underlying positioning system in a very non-fussy, very speculative, very error-prone manner, because our verification system can come over the top of it, look at all the proposed matches or location matches, and throw out a bunch of them which it considers are unsafe or have low reliability. And so what's happening here, comparing it to this system, in the shaded region, you can see our system is adding a whole bunch more of these green crosses or true positives, while only adding a relatively small number of the red false positives or incorrect matches. resulting in much better performance. Same goes for comparison to a baseline system with matching precision performance. We add a lot more correct localization matches and are able to, with only a few extra false positives. So this verification procedure is taking any underlying system and making it perform at a higher level. And this is,
you had 3 colors there, though. You only
oh,
told me
there's 4 colors.
4 colors.
So in the interest of time, these cyan dots, these cyan dots are some of the matches that the underlying system thought were good matches and the verification system threw out. And these are called, these are matches that the underlying system has just decided not to make an estimate. And once again, we'd be interested in exploring more with the neuroscientists, how is, I guess, confidence and certainty in your task encoded in neurally and behaviorally represented. And we know examples in spatial navigation of how like systematic search strategies somewhat reflect uncertainty in where an ant is, for example, when returning to the nest. But I think this is something that would be really interesting to explore further. All right, to wrap up, we're always interested in chatting. It's awesome to be here again and traveling. We're starting to have students and researchers come to Australia. So if you want to come for an exchange, if you want to collaborate on big multinational projects and everything in between, we are more than happy to chat. So just reach out to me. If you want, if you're interested in these, come grab one of these. They're good for kids of all ages and also the Joko Estella's CEOs as well. If you want open source code, there's a lot of open source code available online. We do a lot of survey and publication papers while we can before ChatGPT does it all for us.
Okay.
Lots of our other projects are online if you want to learn any more. We're always hiring. I'm not trying to poach anyone, but we have roles from research assistants. We have a gazillion PhD positions open, all the way up to faculty roles. We have a faculty role in control, actually. Control and robotics, a junior faculty role. So John, I don't think
Oh, am I?
It's not too late.
Are you saying I'm ruled out?
No, I would never. And if you're a grad student or early career researcher, one of the things I'm very passionate about is mentoring. So I do a heck of a lot of mentoring around surviving and prospering in academia. I have a channel called Hacking Academia, which gives you all the unfiltered, blunt information that you can use however you see fit, including negotiating with your employer. So if you want to get some tips and tricks that are not filtered, this is not endorsed by my university. Look up the keyword Hacking Academia. Thanks to our supporters, our lab, very fortunate to work with an amazing bunch of people and all of our collaborators around the world, including many in the room. And thank you.
That was really cool. Thank you. So, thinking about the analogy between spatial navigation and natural vision, it seems like the fields haven't really converged as much as they might, because in natural vision, our eyes, not only are we moving around the world, but our eyes are constantly in motion. There's these levels of compression to the retina that are respected throughout the visual system. I wonder if you might comment as to what nail that hammer might hit, and if there are insights from spatial navigation that would inform capabilities of some future computer vision system respects to this natural property.
So I've been in research for 20 years. The sweet time to do that was 20 years ago when hand tilt zoom cameras were all the vogue. You had them on robots everywhere. They were zoomable, they were actuable, and they were there for a reason, because you couldn't just put a gigapixel camera on your robot and see everything to infinite detail, which basically took away that as a practical problem. So a lot of the practical motivation for doing it more intelligently and interestingly like that has just disappeared. Any interest in compute efficiency has almost disappeared from the robotics community in the last 5 or 10 years. That said, there's a lot of, it's not what you're saying, there's a lot of interesting work on salience, gist, to improve the performance of these systems in terms of active visions and saccades. I don't think that there is work on that. We've done some work on that. We did some work with Harvard many years ago. I don't know if there's a particularly burgeoning field. I think, and this is pure speculation, I think you would have to hook up that research to some of these more neuromorphic spiking neural network backends for it to make more sense as an ecosystem. And that means you have to do it all together, which is very hard. So it would take someone with a lot of funding and timing runway to really give that a good crack.
So I was interested in your work on the, temporal scaling and going from microseconds to seconds to minutes and so on. And it looked like you were training on all the different levels so that you would cover the scale. Or were you doing cases where you would train on one level and then generalize to other scales?
So most of the industry projects we showed, for practical and budget reasons, we train on a specific set of scales, and that is a specific set of scales in which it's deployed. I have a PhD student and some other research at the moment where we are trying to revisit the multi-scale grid cells again, although Ilafit devastated me by saying there's only like 3 levels of scales or something.
Well, there's 5.
There's 5. Okay, well, 5's better than 3. We're trying to create, again, a generic framework based off those that combines, I guess, some of the rigor of the models that she's done with some of the real-world practical performance on deployed robots under real-world conditions with challenging visual situations. And that is supposed to be a generic framework which works across all of the scales. And it's been very, very difficult to do, but we're getting some really promising initial results. For example, in terms of imagine you had a robot that spent a lot of its ecology system moving around in an environment this big, and then it metamorphosized and got up and flew 100 kilometers to a nesting site or something. The systems seem to have great potential for enabling that inherently, even though there's a huge range of navigational scales that single organism is operating at. So very early days, but we're having another crack at it.
I was asking partly because Mark has shown multi-scale temporal coding, not so much discretized like grid cells, but definitely different scales.
Yeah, it would be interesting to chat more.
The event-driven cameras, are those hardware versions of event-driven, or are they regular cameras with the software layer?
No, it's generally done in the hardware, which means there's a lot of nightmarish tuning of the hardware to get the right sensitivity in different light conditions and in different speed regimes. So it's done properly in the hardware. There are now, as of like 12 months ago, some pretty good simulators where if you don't have an event camera, you can get pretty realistic simulated event camera data from a conventional camera. We've used that and trained on it, and it's a pretty good substitute up to an extent.
And then a completely different question, since you mentioned ChatGPT at the end, with the introspection, the chatbots have a tendency to make up stuff when they don't know things. So is there a way to apply some of the introspection ideas onto those domains? What they lack, of course, is the physical reality that robotics is working in.
Yeah. So our introspection techniques deliberately don't need to understand almost anything about the inner mechanics of the system. They work purely on the outputs, and there's nothing particularly tied to embodiment. So that's a good idea. We're trying to get our heads around all these new techniques, and I didn't actually connect the introspection stuff we've done to those, but I will think about that. Thank you.
Nobody else has a question?
Yeah.
Oh.
So you talk a little bit at the end about the confidence as is used in the brain, and also that you use, for instance, variants to detect which
Pixels are salient.
There is some overall theme that you see, like you also talked about like introspection, about like using confidence as a way to improve performance. Do you have like a overarching view of how to use it, or?
So in robotics, it's really simple, because if you have any task you're doing in robotics, object recognition, localization, whatever it is, if you apply this if you have an introspection system that can run over the top of it, you get more trust in understanding like when to trust the system, but you can just turn around and immediately boost the performance. So you already get much better performance, which is great for publishing papers. In terms of the neural side of things, that's why I'm just throwing random things out of the room. I'm very vaguely familiar with some of the behavioral correlates of uncertainty in various tasks, but I'd love to explore the space further.
So just picking up on one thing you talked about was the different types of errors being having varying degrees of significance, and the track down error and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of geometry in this. I mean, is that part of what I mean, you didn't talk too much about it, but
so it's all those effects that we've observed in our limited observation are all effects. Often they're caused by the geometry or the nature of the environment. But we would still argue that in the general case, and this is why I'm interested in spatial neuroscience, even more abstract concepts of how you assess the error for even like place categorization. So I'm just ad-libbing here, but if you have a robot that's thinks it's in a kitchen, which is a type of place, not a specific place, the significance of the error of it being in the kitchen or not really depends on the context and what it's trying to do, right? And I bet there'd be fascinating stuff to unpack in the animal neuroscience about sort of how you unpack our current population decoding field analysis work based on the different contexts that exist within an experiment, for example.
So it seems like one of the best approaches for finding the position and disposition systems is camera, not surprisingly, but also the cameras and recording and images are the techniques that pose the biggest privacy risks and threat. Do you have any sort of like ideas how to mitigate that?
Yep. So this is something the field is keenly aware of. There is lots of interesting work in, I guess you call it privacy by design, where the hardware is using hardware compute to encrypt images at acquisition time in a way that is theoretically very hard to recover. That's one solution. That is also a potential solution to fake image generation and fake text generation. So you implant the watermarks at creation time that are very hard to fake. In that global navigation project, we have a totally different way of doing it where there's no encryption. The data is just inherently privacy preserving. I can't really describe it in any more details, but that's something that is front and center of what we're trying to do. Because if society doesn't accept it and tolerate it, then the technology is utterly useless.
Right.
And you can see places like, maybe not so much in the States at the moment, places like Europe, their regulation has had a very substantial effect on the sort of technologies that are deployed.